Good Sunday morning. I'm Jaden Jefferson, and welcome to this week's Community Focus. My guest is Pierce Reed, Director of Policy and Engagement at the Ohio Innocence Project. We're discussing what the project's efforts entail, as well as how wrongful convictions impact everyone, not just those who are wrongfully convicted.
The Ohio Innocence Project is part of the College of Law at the University of Cincinnati, and we rely on students and faculty at the law school to help people who are factually and morally innocent of crimes, but nonetheless find themselves convicted and imprisoned. And no one knows how much this happens, but the best data is really since about 1989, 1990. And there are almost 3,700 documented cases of wrongful conviction in the United States. That doesn't mean that there aren't more, but those are the best records that we have. Here in Ohio, there are at least 100 exonerations on record, but there's probably a lot more than that as well. And to be exonerated, there has to be a ruling by a court, a legislature, or a governor, some kind of executive, declaring that someone is wrongfully convicted. Or in Ohio, the term that's used is a wrongfully imprisoned individual. But the reality is that a lot of people who have been wrongfully convicted will take a plea deal to regain their freedom. So the numbers, as bad and as sobering as they are probably not at all indicative of the true magnitude of the problem. And for anybody who's listening, who's here in Ohio, it's really important for them to understand that Ohio is still a death penalty state. A lot of young people don't realize that because we haven't seen executions carried out while Governor DeWine has been in office, at least not many of them. But when I came back to Ohio in 2004, 2005, Ohio was one of the leaders in the country with executions. We executed someone every 6 weeks or so.
Wow.
And there are still over 100 people on our death row here in Ohio. And there have been at least 11 exonerations of people from our own death row. So one of the things that is important, and part of why we're in Toledo this evening, is just to remind people of that simple fact. It's something that everyone already knows, which is that humans make mistakes. None of us are divine. None of us have the capacity to be perfect at all times. And we're also taught that we need to take responsibility when we make a mistake. We apologize, we make amends, we try to remedy the situation. But unfortunately, the higher the stakes, like a death sentence, and the more public the apology or recognition of fault would be, the less likely it is to happen. So we're really doing everything we can just to make sure people understand that the death penalty poses great risk to innocent people. We're not partisan. We don't weigh into issues unrelated to innocence. But I think regardless of what someone's politics or faith or however we divide ourselves, one of the things that everybody agrees on is that innocent people shouldn't be executed. And if we maintain the death penalty in Ohio, it's really not that question of whether it'll happen. The question is when will it happen? And so we really appreciate opportunities like this just to get that message out.
You mentioned that plea deals are one of the ways in which people will end up being convicted of something they didn't do because out of desperation, they just want what is the best situation and best outcome they can get. What are some other ways in which people are, through the criminal justice system, led to be convicted of something they had no involvement in?
Well, there's all kinds of different factors that go into it. Right now, I think there's a lot of pushback about some honest conversations that we need to have. One of the biggest factors is bias. That can be bias based on race or gender or identity or orientation. But it's also a matter of what I was saying earlier, that we just make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes may be in an eyewitness identification or a memory. And there's great resources available on our website for anybody who's interested in learning more about that. People also have a hard time believing that you would falsely confess to a crime that you didn't commit. But the reality is that under the right circumstances, anybody can reach that breaking point. And some people are more vulnerable than others. People with mental health or cognitive disabilities are more likely to falsely confess than other people. Juveniles, and what we mean by that in the law is someone who's younger. It's not just a matter of being under 18, it's really someone under the age of 24. And particularly for boys and men, the biology of the way the brain develops can be very different. And part of what goes with that is something I think most parents and guardians understand. We have to teach young people, don't text and drive, don't use drugs, because they're not great at balancing the long-term consequences of a choice versus the short-term rewards. And that dynamic plays out in an interrogation room as well. A young person has about a 1 in 4 chance of falsely confessing to a crime he or she or they didn't commit just because of the psychological pressure that goes through that. And that doesn't mean that the law enforcement officer is doing anything wrong. It's meant to be a high pressure situation because the reality is a lot of horrible crimes do get committed. And all of us want to hold people accountable for things like violence or sexual assault. We may have debates about what proper punishment looks like, but we all want our loved ones to be protected. And so I think there's sometimes a misperception that innocence projects are against law enforcement or against prosecutors. We're not. Everybody makes mistakes, including defense attorneys. All we're doing is trying to get people to understand that and to understand the underlying reasons. So there's a lot of things that go into causing wrongful convictions. Some of them are deliberate, somebody acting with an intention to cause a wrongful conviction, knowing the person's innocent. But most wrongful convictions are just as likely to be the result of a simple error. And the one other thing that I think is really important for people to realize is that science is not as objective as we sometimes believe it to be. The fact that something's empirical doesn't mean it can't be subject to some kind of bias. But we all know, even in the field of medicine, that a treatment at any one point is not definitive. It's the best we have at that moment.
Right.
But we know that science and medicine are going to continue to grow. And part of what innocence projects do is help find errors in science that occurred years, if not decades before, and just point out that was faulty science. Again, it doesn't mean someone was trying to cause a wrongful conviction. It was just a misunderstanding. And additional knowledge helps us recognize the growth that we've had. The law just doesn't like to revisit the past. Science builds on it, the law clings to it.
Yeah, we get new information all the time through science, and obviously the law keeping pace with that is just something that we have just not seen. And one interesting thing is just the long-term impacts of people that are wrongfully convicted, because obviously some of the things they lose out on are time with family. We know that obviously going into the economy again and getting work can be difficult. What are some of the other challenges that people may not think about when someone is wrongfully convicted and then released?
Well, one thing is for every person who's wrongfully convicted, other people are also impacted. We rightfully focus on the person who's been imprisoned, and I never want to take anything away from those people. But I think people overlook that every single person has a mother. That doesn't mean that they don't also have a father or children or siblings, but that entire set of loved ones is also impacted by a wrongful conviction, as are their communities. So there's this ripple effect that ends up almost being like a tsunami as it goes out farther and farther. But for the clients themselves and to some degree their loved ones, one of the things is that they carry kind of the badges of wrongful conviction. The government doesn't have a magic wand to wipe away years of records, even electronically. So for a lot of people, that conviction's still going to stay on their record. There will be a notation that the conviction's been overturned, but that doesn't mean that people on the outside recognize that.
It still
And
changes the way you see that person.
exactly. And it may have real life consequences in terms of licensure. Depending on what kind of the offense it was, you may not be able to get a driver's license. You may not be able to work in a certain field. There may be other restrictions, including where you live. Those things all impact both health, physically, as well as emotional health and economic health. All of our clients have some form of post-traumatic stress disorder because of the experience that they've been through. Many of them also have depression and anxiety. And although Ohio, and particularly Lucas County, does a really good job at trying to transition people back into their communities through programming while they're still imprisoned, the difference for wrongfully convicted people is that they are being freed in a relatively quick fashion. Not quick in terms of after they went into prison, but if I was guilty of a crime and convicted and imprisoned, I'd be given an out date. That's what it's called, the day that I'm going to be finally released. And so our government has that same date and helps people while they're still imprisoned get information that will make it easier for them to go back to work, to find a home, to sign up for things like health insurance. But in a wrongful conviction case, more likely than not, it's going to move very, very quickly right at the end. People can wait decades to get a hearing, and then with 72 hours go from their cell to freedom. And what gets lost in that process is information about how do you find your Social Security card
Yeah.
or get a new one? How do you sign up for Medicaid or SNAP? Because you're going to need those things. The government doesn't hand anything to a wrongfully convicted person on their way out of an institution. And if those people don't have someone to support them, they're going to have very bad outcomes. And just the other thing I don't think people realize is that Ohio's prisons are not healthy, happy places. These are not where you go to make ponchos. These are some of the most difficult environments that someone can live in. So aside from the psychological aspects of what that experience is like, they also have a lot of long-term medical and health impacts as well. Nutrition in prison is based on calorie count, not quality of food. So years and years of high carb, high sodium, maybe high sugar diets are not good for anybody, just biological fact. Prisons, as we learned during COVID, are very confined places. You can't separate yourself from viruses. So aside from COVID, there's tuberculosis. There are all kinds of other airborne diseases that spread, and you don't get very much health care in prison. So when you come out, you're already in a deficit. Your life expectancy has been reduced, and most likely the quality of your internal organs and vital systems are also impacted. So part of what we do is try and get people in for a good medical exam, a good dental exam, and a good eye exam as quickly as possible. And unfortunately, there are times when people are coming out of prison who have very significant health issues that have never been diagnosed, including cancer.
Hmm.
So they're already behind the ball, and we're trying to get them the best services that we can. But every Innocence Project is strapped for resources. So we make these very difficult kind of Sophie's choices, where are you going to put money towards a DNA test, or are you going to put money towards helping someone meet co-payments for x-rays or some kind of medical treatment? And there's
Hard
no right
choice.
or wrong answer. Yeah, exactly. Very, very hard choices.
And really, it comes down to dignity as well. Dignity is very important. And so, legislatively, what would you say are some of the hardest barriers to get through in terms of changing the system so that everyone can have dignity and at the same time that respect and opportunity to be released if there just was something not right in their trial?
Well, I think legislatures are really struggling right now for all the reasons that we see, no matter what program we might be watching, whether that's MSNBC or Fox. People are just tired of talking to each other. They're not listening to each other. It's very hard to build consensus anymore because we're so polarized.
Yeah.
We look at someone's label or how they identify without realizing that we all, regardless of political or philosophical viewpoints, really do have common interest in this. And I see that a lot in some of the debates about the current efforts to both abolish the death penalty, which have been ongoing in Ohio for years, and then at the same time, other legislators introducing bills that would make it easier for us to execute people. And so part of what we do as advocates is have conversations just like the one you and I are having. And what we're always thinking about is why it might resonate. There are all kinds of arguments against the death penalty, for example. Some of those have nothing to do with moral or religious beliefs, although that is one strand for both Republicans and Democrats in our Ohio General Assembly. But for other ones, it's more of an economic issue. They're looking at how much money it costs to carry out an execution. They're looking at how much money it costs to have a capital trial, especially in counties that don't have the resources. Those are all dollars that could be spent on roadways or on schools or on hospitals. And those are good debates to have. But for us, we take it back to this reality that we're going to execute an innocent person. And what I think is unspoken by some members of the legislature is that they're willing to accept that. You, I think that they think if you get it right 95% of the time, that's good enough. But no one's going to say that. It's more an implicit part of it. So we're always looking for ways that we can build bipartisan support for some kind of common sense, practical solution. And Ohio has been good for us in a lot of ways, the General Assembly. About 7 years ago, they did provide some relief in forms of financial compensation for people who have been wrongfully convicted. They have passed a law that now requires law enforcement officers to record custodial interrogations. Until 3 or 4 years ago, there was never any obligation for that to happen. And the two representatives that were involved in that bill as the lead sponsors were very different people. One is a conservative Republican, one was a more progressive Democrat. And they may have had different reasons for supporting the bill, but they worked hand in hand to move that bill forward and through the General Assembly. And ultimately, it passed unanimously. So we can get there. It just takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And that takes us back to the point of how does an Innocence Project spend money? You know, we have to figure out how much are we going to invest in legislative reform, even though we recognize that's important, and how much are we going to invest in investigation and litigation for
Yeah.
people who are there. And there's no easy answers to any of that.
And that's a systemic solution, just providing transparency into investigations, because we're definitely living in one of the most transparent ages in history, where obviously people are recording everything, documenting everything. The same can be applied to these cases where some things may be lost in translation, forgotten, intentionally hidden. Obviously, we wouldn't want that, but that can be a factor as well. So there are all of
Mhm.
those factors involved at play. My final question for you kind of involves the public side of things, because the public's mindset also has to be changed about what a good criminal justice system looks like, because people portray it as everyone who does something wrong goes to jail, but it's not as simple as that, and there's room for error. So how do you change public perception?
Well, one part of it is to remember that absolutely no one benefits from a wrongful conviction except for the person who committed the crime. And again, that's one of those things I think 99% of people would agree is just wrong. And particularly in cases in which a sexual assault is involved, what we've seen anecdotally is that while an innocent person is sitting in prison for that crime, the person who committed it is not only still free, but often reoffending against other people. And that's a horrible experience for anybody to go through. But it seems even more horrible to me that it could have been preventable. We're probably not going to be able to stop every homicide or every sexual assault. But if we would have just got it right in that case, it would have made a difference in somebody's life. And that could be somebody that I love. That could be a member of my family or one of my friends or one of my neighbors. And I think people need to stop and take a little bit of a step back and think about it that way. We have a tendency to think about crime as something happening to other people. Depending on what community you're from and where you grow up, that could be different. But I think a lot of the people most likely to vote and to serve on juries don't realize that everybody's at risk when it's a wrongful conviction. And I guess that's my other point, is just to remind people that if you don't vote, you're most likely not going to be a juror. Both voting and jury service are, to me, obligations as an American and as an Ohioan. They're not always particularly pleasant tasks. And last fall, especially with the difficult conversations the country was having, what was so hard for me is the number of young people, both high school and college students, who would just say, I'm not going to vote because I don't like anybody. Well, that may be understandable when it came to the presidential race. But when they didn't show up at the polls, they didn't vote for every state representative in the state of Ohio. They didn't represent, they didn't vote for 3 of the 7 justices on our Supreme Court.
And this happens at the state and local level a lot of the time.
Exactly. And state and local is going to have so much more impact on your life than what's happening nationally. And that's the part where your voice isn't heard. You don't have to speak on every issue, but you really should make sure that you're voting to protect your own community and your own loved ones, and to take the opportunity to serve on a jury if you're asked. It will inconvenience you in the short time. But think about if it was somebody you cared about who was on trial or in a dispute. If you don't have informed, thoughtful people in that jury box, the outcome is not going to be good.
Yeah, people don't realize there are externalities because whatever is dumped in the river is going to flow downriver, and everyone else is going to see that eventually. And so that's a very important thing, an important mindset to have, especially when we talk about issues like this, where it's easy to be isolationist and not engage with the subject. But every decision made will impact us one way or another, maybe not directly, but indirectly. And so I appreciate you for coming on the show and offering your perspective.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And that's this week's Community Focus. I'm Jaden Jefferson. Have a great start to your week.